The gates of Thorn Palace slammed shut behind the last carriage, and Elira Marsh felt her stomach drop as the sound echoed across the courtyard like a verdict. 3,000 women stood shoulder to shoulder under the gray morning sky, all of them trembling with the same nervous hope, and she was the only one who wished she could disappear into the stone beneath her feet. She had not asked to be here. Her brother Garrick had signed her name on the selection scroll without telling her, and by the time she found out, the guards were already at their door with a summons that could not be refused. An Omega who ignored a royal summons brought shame on her whole pack, and shame was something her family could not afford, not with the debts they owed to the northern packs. So here she stood, wrapped in a plain gray cloak, while women around her wore silk dyed in every color of a sunset, their hair braided with gold thread, their scents sweetened with oils meant to catch an alpha's nose from across a crowded hall. Elira kept her eyes down. She had learned long ago that the safest place in any room was the corner nobody looked at. A horn sounded, sharp and sudden, and the crowd surged forward like a wave breaking against rock. Women pushed past her, elbows digging into her ribs, voices rising into a single desperate hum. Somewhere ahead, palace guards in black and silver uniforms began calling out instructions, directing the contestants toward the long stone steps that led up into the great hall. Elira let herself be carried by the current of bodies, her heart pounding not with excitement, but with the simple fear of being trampled. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the kingdom had heard them. King Alaric Thorn had taken the throne 2 years ago, after his father's sudden death, and in that time, he had not chosen a mate, despite pressure from every noble pack in the land. Advisors whispered that a king without a queen was a king without an heir, and a king without an heir was a king whose throne could be challenged. So the selection had been called, the first of its kind in 3 generations, and every unmated woman between the ages of 18 and 25 had been ordered to attend, regardless of rank, regardless of blood. It was, Elira thought bitterly, the cruelest kind of lottery. Thousands of women uprooted from their homes, competing for the affection of a man none of them had ever met, all so the kingdom could sleep easier at night. She did not want to be queen. She did not want the crown, the ceremonies, the endless eyes watching her every move. All she wanted was to survive the next few weeks without drawing attention, and then quietly return home, or better yet, be sent somewhere far away where nobody knew her name. The great hall, when she finally stepped inside it, took her breath away despite herself. Marble pillars rose toward a ceiling painted with the stars of every constellation known to the packs, and chandeliers dripped crystal light over a floor so polished she could see her own frightened reflection staring back at her. Thousands of women arranged themselves in rows facing a raised dais, and on that dais stood a throne carved from black wood, empty for now, waiting. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Elira caught fragments of conversation around her, contestants sizing each other up, trading rumors about the king's temperament, his strength, the size of his territory, the number of packs sworn to his banner. A woman beside her, dressed in deep crimson, with a fox's confidence in her eyes, muttered to her companion that she had trained for this moment since she was 12 years old, learning every etiquette rule, every scent-masking technique, every way to make an alpha's eyes linger. Elira had trained for nothing. She had spent her mornings grinding herbs for the pack healer, and her evenings mending torn clothes by candlelight, because that was what an Omega with no dowry and no standing did to earn her place at the table. She did not know how to flirt. She did not know how to compete. She only knew how to be quiet, how to be small, how to make herself so unremarkable that no one thought to notice her at all. A hush fell over the hall. The great doors behind the dais opened, and the king entered. Elira had imagined him 100 different ways in the days since the summons arrived, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of him. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man she had seen, and he moved with the kind of quiet control that spoke of restrained strength rather than performed power. His hair was dark, cut short and practical, and his eyes, even from this distance, held a sharpness that seemed to take in everything at once and reveal nothing in return. He wore no crown, only a simple black coat with silver clasps, as though the throne itself were burden enough without extra ornamentation. He did not smile, he did not wave. He simply walked to his throne and sat, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath as one. Beside him stood an older man with silver at his temples, and a folder of parchment tucked under his arm. This, Illyra would later learn, was Colton Briggs, the king's chief advisor, the man who had pushed hardest for the selection to take place. Briggs stepped forward and began to speak, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, explaining the rules that would govern the weeks ahead. There would be trials of character, tests of loyalty, formal introductions, private audiences. Each week, a portion of the contestants would be dismissed, sent home with a modest gift and the kingdom's gratitude, until only a small circle remained. From that circle, the king would choose his mate. Illyra listened with half an ear, more focused on counting the exits than on the details of the competition. She had no intention of surviving past the first dismissal, and honestly, she hoped for it. The sooner she was sent home, the sooner she could return to her small, familiar life, herbs and mending, and the quiet comfort of routine. But then Briggs said something that made her lift her head despite herself. "The king will now walk among you," he announced, to offer his first impressions of the women gathered here today. A ripple of excitement, sharp and electric, passed through the crowd. Women straightened their spines, lifted their chins, arranged their features into expressions of practiced charm. Illyra felt the urge to shrink further into her cloak, to become as invisible as the shadow of a pillar. The king rose from his throne and descended the dais steps. He walked slowly, his gaze moving over the rows of contestants with the same unreadable sharpness Illyra had noticed from across the hall. Women turned toward him like flowers turning toward the sun, some offering shy smiles, others bold curtsies, a few even daring to speak as he passed, offering their names, their pack titles, their eagerness. He acknowledged each with the barest nod, his expression never shifting from its careful neutrality, and moved on. Illyra kept her eyes on the floor. She did not want his attention. She wanted, more than anything, to be forgotten in this sea of thousands, one more gray cloak among rows of silk and color. She felt him before she saw him, a shift in the air, a change in the quality of silence around her, and when she finally lifted her eyes, the king had stopped walking. He was not looking at the crimson-dressed woman beside her, who had gone very still with anticipation. He was not looking at the elegant contestant 2 rows ahead, who had already begun to smile in expectation of his attention. He was looking at Illyra. Her heart seized in her chest. For one terrible moment, she thought she had done something wrong, broken some rule of etiquette she did not know existed, and her mind raced through apologies before she even understood what she might be apologizing for. But the king said nothing. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes moving over her plain gray cloak, her downturned face, the way her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her, as though bracing for impact. She realized, with a jolt of confusion, that she was the only woman in the entire hall who had not looked up to meet his gaze until this very moment. Every other contestant had angled herself toward him the instant he drew near, eager and hopeful. Illyra had kept her eyes on the marble floor, and it was only the strange quality of his attention that had finally pulled her gaze upward. For a heartbeat, something flickered across his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was not quite indifference either. Curiosity, perhaps, or surprise. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The king inclined his head, the same small acknowledgement he had given every other woman, and continued down the row. Illyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Beside her, the crimson-dressed woman turned with narrowed eyes. "What was that?" she asked, her voice low and sharp. "Do you know him? Have you met before?" "No," Illyra said quickly. "Honestly, I've never seen him in my life." The woman studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, before turning her attention back to the king's retreating figure. Illyra wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she could sink into the floor. She did not understand what had just happened, why his gaze had lingered even for that brief second, but she understood instinctively that it was not a good thing. Attention, in a competition like this, was dangerous. Attention made enemies. She spent the rest of the ceremony trying to make herself smaller, quieter, more forgettable than ever, but she could feel eyes on her now, curious and calculating, women recalculating whether the quiet Omega in the gray cloak was truly as harmless as she appeared. When the ceremony finally ended, and the contestants were led toward the west wing to be assigned their sleeping quarters, Illyra walked in silence, her mind replaying that single moment over and over, the king's eyes on her face, the flicker of something unreadable in his expression. She told herself it meant nothing, that she had simply been unusual enough to catch his notice for a heartbeat, an anomaly in a sea of eager faces, nothing more. But some small, treacherous part of her could not stop wondering what he had seen when he looked at her, and why, out of thousands of women desperate for his attention, he had chosen to notice the one who wanted none of it at all. The West Wing corridors stretched on for what felt like miles, lined with identical doors leading to identical rooms, each one meant to house 4 contestants for the duration of the selection. Alira found her assigned door near the end of the hall, close to a narrow window that looked out over the palace gardens, and pushed it open to find 3 other women already inside, unpacking trunks far grander than her single worn bag. One of them, a tall woman with warm brown skin and an easy smile, looked up first. "You must be our 4th, she said, extending a hand. "I'm Marin Cole, from the Eastern Hill Packs." Alira shook her hand carefully. Alira Marsh. The introduction rippled through the room, the other 2 women offering their names with varying degrees of interest, and Alira set her bag down on the one remaining bed, grateful that at least this small space might offer some measure of peace before the trials began in earnest. She did not yet know that peace, in a palace filled with thousands of hopeful hearts and one unreadable king, was a luxury she would not be allowed to keep for long. Night fell over Thorn Palace, and somewhere beyond the West Wing, in a private study lined with old books and older maps, the king sat alone by candlelight, turning a single unremarkable image over and over in his mind. Not the face of the woman in crimson who had smiled so eagerly, not the elegant contestant who had spoken his name with practiced warmth, only a pair of downcast eyes finally lifting to meet his, startled and utterly without artifice, the only honest reaction in a hall full of performance. He did not know her name. He told himself it did not matter, but he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he wanted to know it anyway. Colton Briggs entered without knocking, as was his habit, carrying a fresh stack of reports on the noble packs whose daughters had entered the selection. "The Voss family has sent their eldest," he said, without preamble, setting the papers on the desk. "Leanne Voss. Strong bloodline, powerful pack, exactly the kind of alliance we discussed. You should make a point of speaking with her tomorrow." The king did not look up from the candle flame. "I spoke with a great many women today." And nothing," he said, though the word did not sit quite right, even in his own mouth. "It was a long day, Colton. Let me rest." Briggs studied him for a moment longer, sensing something unspoken beneath the king's carefully even tone, but he was wise enough not to push. He gathered his reports and left, and the king remained alone with his candle and his thoughts, unable to shake the memory of a quiet Omega in a gray cloak, who had wanted, more than anything, not to be seen at all. By the second morning, word of the king's brief pause had already spread through the West Wing, like fire through dry grass. Alira woke to the sound of hushed voices outside her door, and when she stepped into the corridor to fetch water, 3 women fell silent and stared at her with open suspicion, before hurrying away. She had no idea how the story had traveled so fast, or how it had grown in the telling, but by the time she reached the dining hall for the morning meal, she understood the damage had already been done. "There she is," someone murmured, just loud enough to carry. "The one the king looked at." Alira kept her head down and took her seat beside Marin, who offered her a sympathetic glance, but said nothing, until the surrounding tables had returned to their own conversations. "You should eat something," Marin said quietly, sliding a plate of bread and fruit toward her. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Alira admitted. "I don't understand why everyone is talking about me." He looked at me for 1 second. That's all it was. 1 second is enough, in a place like this. Marin's voice was kind but honest. 3,000 women came here hoping for exactly that 1 second, and most of them will leave without ever getting it. You got it on the very first day, without even trying. That makes you interesting. And interesting, in the selection, is not always a safe thing to be. Alira pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. She thought of home, of the quiet healer's cottage where she spent her days grinding herbs into paste, where the worst thing she had to worry about was whether Garrick would drink away the household coin before the month's end. That life had never felt like freedom before, but compared to the tangled politics of the palace, it seemed almost peaceful now. The morning trial, announced by a palace herald shortly after breakfast, was called the Trial of Grace, though Alira suspected the name was far kinder than the reality would prove to be. Contestants were led into a long courtyard, where servants had arranged an obstacle of etiquette challenges, balancing trays of crystal glasses while walking a narrow beam, reciting the formal greetings owed to each ranking pack, without stumbling over a single title, holding a posture of perfect stillness, while palace judges circled and critiqued every flaw. Alira had never learned formal etiquette. Her family had no standing worth the lessons, and she had spent her childhood learning practical things instead. How to set a broken bone, how to brew a fever tonic, how to stretch a single loaf of bread across a week of hungry mouths. She watched the other contestants glide through the trial with practiced elegance, their years of preparation evident in every graceful step, and felt her stomach twist with dread as her own turn approached. When her name was called, she stepped onto the narrow beam with a tray of glasses trembling in her hands, and for one horrifying moment, she was certain she would drop every single one. But something steadied her. Some instinct born of years spent carrying fragile herb jars across uneven cottage floors, and she found her balance, slow and careful, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the far end without a single glass shattering. The judges exchanged glances, unimpressed by her lack of formal polish but unable to deny her steadiness. She did not recite the noble titles with the same flourish as the other contestants, stumbling once over the proper address for a Western pack lord, but she corrected herself quietly and moved on without panic, without the flustered apologies that undid several other hopeful women that morning. She was not the best. She was not even close to it, but she survived the trial without disgrace, and for now, that was enough. It was during the break between trials, while contestants gathered in the shade of the courtyard's old oak trees, that Leanne Voss first approached her. Alira recognized the name before she recognized the face, having heard it whispered reverently among the other contestants since the moment she arrived. Leanne was the eldest daughter of one of the most powerful alpha packs in the Northern Territories, and she carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own worth. Her hair was the color of polished copper, braided with small silver charms that caught the light with every movement, and her eyes, when they settled on Alira, held a sharpness that made the hair on the back of Alira's neck rise. "So, you're the one," Leanne said, her voice pleasant on the surface, but edged with something colder beneath. The girl the king noticed. "I'm not anyone special," Alira said carefully. "It was only a glance. Glances mean things, in a place like this." Leanne circled her slowly, the way a predator might circle prey it had not yet decided whether to bother with. "Tell me, what pack are you from? I don't recognize the name Marsh from any list of standing." "We're a small pack," Alira admitted, "in the southern valleys. My family has no title." Something like satisfaction flickered across Leanne's face, as though this confirmation settled a question she had already answered in her own mind. "No title," she repeated. "No training, judging by that performance on the beam. No wealth, judging by that cloak you've worn 2 days running." She smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "I'm sure whatever caught the king's eye yesterday was nothing more than curiosity. Kings are curious about strange things sometimes. A dog walking on 2 legs, a bird that cannot fly. It rarely means anything beyond the moment." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, and Alira felt her face flush with a mixture of shame and anger she quickly forced herself to suppress. She had not asked for the king's attention. She did not want it. But hearing herself compared to a curiosity, a strange creature to be gawked at and dismissed, stirred something in her she had not expected. "You're right," Alira said quietly, meeting Leanne's eyes for the first time. "It probably means nothing. I'm not here to compete for his attention, Lady Voss. I'm here because I had no choice. You're welcome to whatever glances you can gather. I won't be in your way." For a moment, something like surprise crossed Leanne's expression, quickly smoothed back into cool composure. She had expected, perhaps, tears or stammering apology, not quiet, unbothered honesty. "How refreshing," she said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "We'll see if that remains true." She turned and walked away, her silver charms chiming softly with each step, leaving Alira standing alone beneath the oak tree, with her heart still hammering from the exchange. Marin appeared at her side a moment later, having watched the confrontation from a careful distance. "That's Leanne Voss," she said unnecessarily. Her pack has sent word to half the noble houses in the kingdom that she intends to be queen by the season's end. You've just made an enemy of the most dangerous woman in this palace." "I didn't make an enemy of anyone," Elira said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I only told her the truth." "The truth doesn't matter to women like her," Meryn said, not unkindly. "Only power matters. And right now, she believes you might have some, even if you don't want it." The afternoon trials passed in a blur of exhaustion, and by the time evening fell, Elira retreated to the narrow window in her shared room, watching the palace gardens below settle into shadow. She thought of Leanne's cold smile, of the whispered rumors following her through every hallway, of the king's unreadable eyes finding hers across a crowded hall. She had come to the palace wanting nothing more than to disappear, and instead, in the span of 2 short days, she had become the subject of every curious and calculating gaze within these walls. She did not sleep well that night either. Somewhere beyond her window, in a study lined with old books, the king sat once more with his candle burning low, listening to Colton Briggs recite a list of names and pack alliances, nodding at the appropriate moments, while his mind drifted, unbidden, to a quiet corner of a crowded courtyard, and a woman, who had walked a narrow beam, with more steadiness than half the trained nobility combined. He did not mention it to Briggs. He was not entirely certain, yet, what there was to mention. By the end of the first week, the number of contestants had already begun to thin. Every evening, palace heralds posted a fresh list on the courtyard gates, and every morning, a fresh wave of carriages arrived to carry dismissed women back to their home packs, their faces ranging from relief to devastation. Elira watched the lists each day with a strange, conflicted feeling, half hoping to see her own name among the dismissed, half afraid of what it would mean to return home in failure, however welcome that failure might feel. Her name never appeared. She told herself it was only luck, that the judges had simply not yet gotten around to dismissing the unremarkable contestants, the ones who caused no scandal and drew no particular praise. But as the days passed and dozens of far more accomplished women were sent away while she remained, a small, uneasy suspicion began to grow in the back of her mind. She said nothing about it to Meryn, who remained the one steady friendship she had found within the palace walls, but she noticed, more than once, palace guards watching her a little too closely, servants offering her portions of food slightly more generous than the other contestants received. She could not decide who was responsible for this quiet, careful protection, or why. The answer came, unexpectedly, on a cold evening near the end of the second week, when a persistent headache drove her from her shared room in search of the physician's wing, hoping for a tonic to ease the pounding behind her eyes. She lost her way twice in the palace's winding corridors, the unfamiliar halls stretching farther than she expected, until she found herself in an unfamiliar wing entirely, quiet and dimly lit, clearly not meant for contestants to wander. She was about to turn back when she heard voices ahead, low and urgent, drifting from behind a half-open door. "Cannot keep protecting her without drawing questions," Colton Briggs was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "The other contestants have noticed. Lady Voss has already begun asking why the Marsh girl has survived 2 dismissal lists, despite scoring in the bottom quarter of every trial. If this continues, there will be talk of favoritism, and talk of favoritism during a selection this important could damage the very alliances we are trying to build." "Let them talk." The king's voice, low and even, carried a note of finality that made Elira freeze in the shadowed corridor, her headache forgotten entirely. "I have not asked you to remove her from consideration, Colton. I have asked you to leave her be. May I ask why?" A long pause stretched through the doorway, long enough that Elira nearly convinced herself the king would not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lowered, quieter than before, as though the words cost him something to admit, even to his most trusted advisor. "Because in a hall full of thousands of women performing for my attention, she was the only one who wanted none of it. Because when I walked among the trials this week, she was the only contestant who did not flinch or preen when I passed, who simply did her work and moved on, as though my presence mattered to her no more than a passing servant's. I find that I want to understand why, Colton, that is all. I am not promising her the throne. I am asking for time to satisfy my own curiosity." Elira's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she was certain the sound alone would give her away. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, torn between the desperate urge to flee and the equally desperate need to hear more, though some part of her already understood she had heard more than enough. Curiosity is a dangerous luxury for a king, Briggs said, though his tone had softened slightly. But I have served your father before you, and I will not pretend I don't understand the weight of choosing a mate under circumstances like these. Take your time if you must, but be careful. The girl has no pack standing to protect her if this attention turns against her rather than toward her. Kindness from a king can become a cruelty if it is not followed through. I am aware of that, the king said quietly. More aware perhaps than you realize. Alira did not wait to hear anything more. She turned and fled down the corridor as quietly as her trembling legs would allow, her headache entirely forgotten, replaced by a storm of confusion and fear that followed her all the way back to her shared room. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the shadowed ceiling, turning the overheard conversation over and over in her mind. The king had been protecting her, deliberately, quietly, without her knowledge or consent. He had kept her name off the dismissal lists, and now Colton Briggs believed the entire palace was on the verge of noticing. She did not know whether to feel grateful or terrified. Perhaps, she realized as the night wore on, she felt both in equal measure. The following morning brought the third trial, the trial of loyalty, in which contestants were tested not on grace or beauty, but on their willingness to defend the values of the crown under pressure. Palace judges posed difficult scenarios, asking each woman how she would respond to a rival pack's betrayal, how she would counsel the king in a moment of political crisis, how far she would go to protect the kingdom's interests, even at personal cost. Alira answered honestly, drawing not on political theory she did not possess, but on the simple, hard-won wisdom of a life spent protecting the people she loved, with whatever meager resources she had. When asked how she would respond if a rival pack threatened her own family's safety in exchange for information, she answered without hesitation that she would protect her family first, and worry about the kingdom's larger politics only after those she loved were safe. Several judges frowned at the answer, clearly hoping for a more diplomatically calculated response. But one judge, an older woman with kind eyes and a healer's calloused hands, nodded slowly, as though Alira's answer had confirmed something she already suspected. That evening, the dismissal list included nearly 200 names. Leanne Voss's name was not among them, unsurprisingly, given her family's standing and her own considerable skill in every trial so far. Alira's name was not among them either, and this time, standing in the crowded courtyard reading the posted parchment beneath flickering torchlight, she understood with sudden, cold clarity that it was not luck keeping her here. Leanne found her only moments later, her copper hair catching the torchlight as she approached with two other contestants trailing behind her like a small, hostile procession. Still here, Leanne observed, her voice light, but her eyes sharp as knives. How curious. I've been asking around. Alira Marsh. Your family owes considerable debts to the northern packs. Your brother drinks away what little coin your household earns. You have no formal training, no pack alliances worth mentioning, and yet somehow, week after week, you remain in this selection, while women far more accomplished than you are, sent home in shame. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to something almost gentle, almost intimate, which made it all the more chilling. I wonder what you're doing, in private, to earn such favor. I wonder what the king would think, if the whole palace learned exactly how you've managed it. The threat, veiled as it was, landed with the force of a physical blow. Alira felt the blood drain from her face, understanding instantly the danger of the accusation Leanne was implying, an accusation that could destroy whatever fragile position she held within the palace, whatever fragile trust the king had begun, unknowingly, to place in her. I've done nothing, Alira said, her voice steadier than she felt. I don't know why I'm still here. I've asked myself the same question every night since the first week. How convenient, Leanne said, that you have no answer at all. She smiled, cold and satisfied, and turned to leave, her companions falling into step behind her. Sleep well, Alira Marsh. I intend to find the truth, one way or another, and when I do, I doubt the king's curiosity will be enough to protect you. Alira stood alone in the emptying courtyard, long after Leanne's footsteps had faded, the torchlight flickering shadows across the ancient stone, and for the first time since arriving at Thorn Palace, she felt truly afraid. Not of the king's attention, but of what that attention might cost her before this selection ever reached its end. She barely slept that night, and when morning came, she moved through her routine in a haze of worry, certain that at any moment, Leanne would find some way to twist the truth into a scandal loud enough to reach the king's ears. Meryn noticed her distraction over breakfast, her brow furrowing with concern. "You look like you're waiting for the ceiling to fall on you," Meryn said, setting down her cup. "What happened last night? I saw Voss corner you near the dismissal list." Elira hesitated, weighing how much to share, before deciding that keeping the fear locked inside her chest was doing her no good at all. In a low voice, she recounted the conversation, the veiled accusation, the threat wrapped in honeyed words. Meryn listened with growing concern, glancing around the dining hall as though Leanne herself might be listening from the shadows. "She's dangerous," Meryn said finally. "Not because she's cruel, though she is that too, but because she's patient. She won't act rashly. She'll gather whatever she can find, twist it until it looks damning, and present it at the moment it will do the most harm. You need to be careful, Elira. Careful about where you walk, who you speak to, what you say, and to whom." "I haven't done anything wrong," Elira said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I never asked for any of this." "I know," Meryn said gently. "But in this palace, innocence isn't always enough to protect you. Sometimes the appearance of guilt does more damage than guilt itself." The words stayed with Elira through the morning's trial, a test of practical skill, in which contestants were asked to demonstrate some talent useful to the running of a kingdom, whether diplomacy, healing, organization, or craft. Many of the remaining contestants showcased elaborate skills learned specifically for this moment, reciting poetry in 3 languages, demonstrating intricate needlework meant to symbolize royal heraldry, performing complicated dances that required years of formal training. When Elira's turn came, she had nothing so impressive to offer. She simply set up a small table with the herbs and tools she had brought from home, and demonstrated, calmly and without flourish, how to properly set a broken bone, how to identify the early signs of fever before they became dangerous, how to brew a tonic that could ease pain without the risks of stronger medicines. It was not glamorous. It drew no gasps of admiration from the watching judges or the assembled contestants. But the healer judge who had nodded at her answer during the loyalty trial watched with quiet, careful attention, and afterward, as Elira gathered her tools to leave, the older woman approached her directly. "Where did you learn this?" the healer asked, examining the careful arrangement of herbs Elira had prepared. "My pack has no proper healer," Elira explained. "I learned what I could from an old woman in our village before she passed, and taught myself the rest from what books I could borrow. It isn't formal training. I know it isn't as impressive as what the other contestants showed today." "Impressive is not the same as useful," the healer said, studying her with new interest. "I've watched 100 women in this selection recite poetry that will never save a single life. You've just shown me 3 remedies that could save dozens, in the hands of someone who actually understood what she was doing. Don't let anyone convince you that quiet skill is worth less than loud performance, child. In my experience, it is usually worth a great deal more." The praise, small as it was, settled something unsteady in Elira's chest, a brief reminder that her worth did not depend entirely on the king's unpredictable attention, or Leanne's calculated threats. She carried that small comfort with her through the rest of the day, though it did little to ease the knot of anxiety that tightened whenever she thought of what Leanne might be planning. That evening, as contestants gathered in the palace's grand dining hall for the formal evening meal, a tradition meant to allow the king brief, informal conversation with his remaining contestants, Elira found herself seated near the far end of a long table, as far from the king's usual position as the seating arrangements allowed. She was grateful for the distance, hoping to pass the evening unnoticed among the murmur of polite conversation and the clink of silver against porcelain. Her hope did not survive the hour. Partway through the meal, a palace servant approached her seat and murmured, quietly enough that only she could hear, that the king requested her presence at the head of the table for a brief exchange, as he had already done with several other contestants that evening in an effort, the servant explained, to grow better acquainted with the women under his consideration. Elira's stomach dropped, but refusing a direct royal request was not something any contestant, however reluctant, was permitted to do. She rose from her seat, aware of the eyes that followed her the length of the hall, and made her way toward the head of the table where the king sat, flanked on either side by contestants, eager for even a moment of his attention. He gestured to the empty seat beside him, and she sat, careful to keep her posture as unremarkable as possible, though her heart hammered so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Elira Marsh," he said, and something in the way he said her full name, deliberate and careful, suggested he had gone out of his way to learn it. "I understand you demonstrated a talent for healing today." "Yes, my lord," she said, keeping her eyes politely lowered, though she could feel the weight of his gaze settled directly on her. "It isn't much. I never had formal training. The physician who judged the trial disagrees rather strongly with your assessment," he said, and though his tone remained even, she thought she detected something almost like amusement beneath the words. "She spoke to me directly after the trial, quite insistent that I take note of your skill. It is rare for her to praise anyone so plainly. I've known her to be far more critical of contestants, with a great deal more formal training than you claim to possess." Elira did not know how to respond to praise relayed secondhand, from a king who had, by all accounts, been quietly protecting her presence in this competition, for weeks without her knowledge. She settled, finally, on simple honesty, the only tool she had ever truly known how to wield. "I only did what I know how to do," she said. "I didn't come here to impress anyone, my lord. I came because I had no choice, and I've tried to be useful in whatever small ways I can, since usefulness is the only thing that's ever felt like it was worth something, where I come from." Something shifted in his expression at that, subtle but unmistakable, a softening around the eyes that had nothing to do with royal formality. "And do you find," he asked quietly, leaning slightly closer so that his next words carried only to her, "that usefulness is enough to satisfy you? Or do you want something more, Elira Marsh, even if you're afraid to say it aloud?" The question caught her entirely off guard, striking closer to some hidden, unexamined truth than she was prepared to admit even to herself. She had spent so many years making herself small, making herself useful, that she had rarely allowed herself to consider what she might want beyond simple survival. "I don't know," she admitted finally, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I've never had the luxury of wanting things, my lord. Only the necessity of managing what I already have." He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the dining hall fading into background murmur around them, and for the first time since she had arrived at Thorn Palace, Elira felt as though someone were truly looking at her, not at the gray cloak, not at the absence of Pack standing, not at the rumors swirling through the palace halls, but at her, plainly and without pretense. "That," he said quietly, "is a luxury I intend to see you afforded, one way or another." He straightened then, his tone shifting back toward the polite formality expected in front of the watching hall, and thanked her graciously for the conversation, before signaling to a servant that the next contestant might approach. Elira returned to her seat at the far end of the table in a daze, aware of the curious, calculating stares following her every step, aware most of all of Leanne Voss's copper hair and narrowed eyes, tracking her from across the hall, with an expression that promised the coming days would bring no peace at all. Sleep offered little relief in the days that followed. Elira found herself replaying the king's question again and again, turning it over in her mind at odd moments, while grinding herbs or walking the palace corridors between trials. "Do you want something more, even if you're afraid to say it aloud?" She had spent so long training herself not to want, that the question felt almost dangerous, like a door she had kept locked for years suddenly creaking open against her will. Unable to settle her restless mind one particular night, she slipped from her room long after the other contestants had fallen asleep, drawn by the memory of open sky and fresh air, rather than any clear destination. The palace gardens, she had learned from a friendly servant, lay just beyond the west wing, accessible through a side door rarely used after dark. She told herself she only wanted a few minutes of quiet, away from whispered rumors and calculating eyes, before returning to her narrow bed. The garden, when she found it, was more beautiful than she had imagined. Moonlight silvering rows of night-blooming flowers, a small fountain trickling softly at its center, stone paths winding between hedges trimmed into elegant shapes. She walked slowly along the nearest path, breathing in the cool air, letting the tension of the past weeks loosen slightly in her shoulders, for the first time since arriving at Thorn Palace. She did not expect to find anyone else there. The king sat on a stone bench near the fountain, alone, his black coat traded for a simpler tunic, his posture less guarded than she had ever seen it in the great hall, or the crowded dining table. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and for a moment, surprise flickered across both their faces in equal measure. "I'm sorry," Alira said quickly, already turning to retreat the way she had come. "I didn't know anyone would be here, my lord. I'll leave you in peace." "Stay," he said, and the simple word carried more weight than she expected, quiet, but unmistakably sincere. "If you'd like to. I find I've had enough of my own company tonight." She hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and a curiosity she could not entirely suppress, before finally crossing the remaining distance and settling onto the far end of the stone bench, careful to leave a respectful space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the gentle trickle of the fountain and the distant call of some night bird settling into the hedges. "You come here often," she said eventually, more observation than question. "When I can escape Colton's endless reports," he admitted, and something in his tone, wry and almost boyish, surprised her, so different from the careful neutrality he wore during the day's formal proceedings. "It's the one place in this palace where no one expects anything of me. No decisions to make, no alliances to weigh, no thousands of hopeful faces waiting for some sign of favor." He glanced sideways at her. "I imagine you understand something of that feeling, given how hard you work to avoid exactly that kind of attention." "I never wanted attention," she said honestly. "I still don't understand why I have it. Would you like me to explain?" She turned to look at him fully then, startled by the directness of the offer, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, patient and searching all at once. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I would." He was quiet for a moment, as though gathering the words carefully before releasing them. "I have spent 2 years on this throne," he said, "surrounded by people who want something from me. Alliances, favor, position. Every smile directed my way carries a calculation behind it, every kind word a hidden request. I have grown so accustomed to this that I nearly forgot what it looked like when someone simply existed in a room without wanting anything from me at all." His gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. "That first day, in the great hall, you were the only woman who did not look at me as though I were a prize to be won. You looked at the floor, at your own hands, anywhere but at me, because the last thing you wanted was my notice. I found that, more than anything else in that entire hall, I could not stop thinking about." Alira's chest tightened with something she could not name, a strange mixture of vulnerability and warmth she had not expected to feel toward the man whose sudden attention had upended her entire existence within the palace walls. "I'm not trying to be mysterious," she said quietly. "I'm not playing some clever game to catch your interest. I really don't want any of this. The selection, the crown, the constant watching. I only want to go home." "I believe you," he said, and something in the simple certainty of his voice made her believe, in turn, that he truly meant it. "That is precisely why I cannot stop paying attention to you, Alira. Everyone else in this palace wants to be queen. You are the only one who doesn't, and somehow, that makes me want to know you all the more." They talked for a long while after that, the conversation drifting from careful formality into something easier, something almost like the natural exchange between two people who had known each other far longer than a handful of brief public encounters. He asked about her home, and she found herself describing the small healer's cottage, the herb garden she tended behind it, the particular quality of light through the valley at sunrise, details she had never thought worth sharing with anyone before. She asked, in turn, about the burden of the crown he had inherited so suddenly, and he spoke, haltingly at first, and then with growing openness, of the weight of his father's expectations, the constant pressure to secure the kingdom's future through an alliance he had never truly chosen for himself. "You didn't want the selection either," she realized aloud, the observation surprising them both. "No," he admitted. "Colton and the council believed it necessary, for the stability of the throne, and I could not argue against their reasoning, without appearing weak in my first years as king. But I confess I dreaded it, the thought of choosing a lifelong companion from among thousands of strangers, each one performing whatever version of herself she believed would please me most." He glanced at her, something almost rueful in his expression. "I did not expect, among all that performance, to find someone who simply refused to perform at all." By the time Alira finally rose to return to her room, the moon had shifted considerably across the sky, and a strange, Fragile lightness had settled over her chest, unfamiliar after weeks of anxiety and careful watchfulness. She did not know what this conversation meant, could not yet guess where it might lead, but for the first time since arriving at Thorn Palace, she felt something that resembled hope rather than dread. "Will you come back?" the king asked, as she paused at the garden's edge. "Not because I command it, only if you wish to." She considered the question for a long moment, weighing the danger of what Leanne might do if this quiet friendship became known, against the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward this man, who had looked past every performance and seen, somehow, exactly who she was underneath. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I would like that." She did not see the figure watching from the shadowed archway near the West Wing entrance as she made her way back to her room, nor did she notice the careful, calculating expression on Leanne Voss's face, as the copper-haired contestant retreated silently into the darkness, already turning the discovery over in her mind, already beginning to plan exactly how she might use it. The following days carried a strange, dual rhythm for Alira, the public trials growing steadily harder as the remaining contestants dwindled, and the private garden meetings with the king becoming, without either of them quite acknowledging it aloud, a nightly habit neither wished to break. He would arrive first, most evenings, and she would find him seated by the fountain, the tension of his royal duties visibly easing from his shoulders the moment their conversation began. They spoke of small things and large things in equal measure, her memories of the southern valleys, his half-formed hopes for the kingdom's future, the particular loneliness of a throne inherited too soon, and carried without anyone to share its weight. She began, though she resisted admitting it even to herself, to look forward to those quiet hours more than anything else in her long, exhausting days. But the palace, as Maren had warned her weeks before, was not a place where secrets remained secret for long. It started with small things, whispers that followed her more pointedly through the corridors, servants who watched her with new and uncomfortable curiosity, contestants who fell silent when she entered a room and resumed their murmured conversations the moment she passed. She told herself she was imagining the shift, that the earlier rumors about the king's brief glance had simply resurfaced, but by the fourth day, Maren pulled her aside after the morning trial, with an expression grave enough to still whatever reassurance Alira might have offered. "You need to know what's being said," Maren told her, guiding her toward a quiet alcove, away from listening ears. "Someone has been talking about the garden, about you meeting the king there, alone, after dark. The story is spreading fast, and it isn't being told kindly." Alira's stomach dropped. How could anyone know? We were careful. There was no one else there. "Someone saw you," Maren said. "I don't know who, but the details being repeated are too specific for guesswork. And Alira, the way the story is being told, it isn't just that you met him. It's being suggested that you've been meeting him improperly, that whatever favor you've earned has nothing to do with honest conversation, and everything to do with something far less innocent." The implication struck Alira like a physical blow, understanding immediately the damage such a rumor could inflict, not only on her own reputation, but on the king's, standing before the very council and noble Pax, whose trust he needed to secure his throne. She thought immediately of Leanne's cold smile in the courtyard weeks before, her veiled threat about discovering the truth one way or another, and felt a sick certainty settle over her that she already knew, without needing further proof, exactly who stood behind this cruel new rumor. "I have to speak with him," Alira said, though even as the words left her mouth, she understood the impossible position such a conversation would place them both in. Any public acknowledgement of the garden meetings would only confirm the rumors already spreading through the palace, while continuing to meet in secret risked deepening the scandal beyond anything either of them could control. She did not have to seek him out. That evening, as contestants gathered once more for the formal dinner, Colton Briggs approached her table directly, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told her immediately something serious had occurred. He asked, with careful formality, that she accompany him to a private audience chamber, and though every eye in the hall followed her departure with renewed and hungry curiosity, she had no choice but to comply. The king was already waiting when she arrived, his expression tighter than she had seen it since their very first, brief exchange in the great hall. Briggs closed the door behind them and remained standing near the entrance, his posture rigid, with the particular tension of a man forced to deliver unwelcome news, to someone he served loyally, but could not fully protect. There is a rumor circulating, Briggs began without preamble, that has reached the ears of 3 separate noble packs within the last day alone. It suggests improper conduct between yourself, Your Majesty, and Miss Marsh, occurring in the palace gardens on multiple occasions. I have managed to contain the worst of the speculation for now, but I must be honest, this is precisely the kind of scandal that could unravel the trust this selection was meant to build. The noble packs are already watching closely, for any sign that the crown cannot be trusted to conduct itself with the discipline they expect. The rumor is a distortion, the king said, his voice controlled but carrying an edge Elira had not heard from him before. Miss Marsh and I have spoken in the gardens, yes. Nothing more than conversation has passed between us. I don't doubt your word, Briggs said carefully, but doubt is not the currency that matters here, Your Majesty. Perception is. And right now, the perception spreading through this palace paints Miss Marsh as a woman who has used improper means to secure favor she has not earned through the trials, and paints you as a king whose judgment cannot be trusted where his personal desires are concerned. Neither perception serves the kingdom well, regardless of the truth beneath them. Elira stood silently through the exchange, humiliation and fear churning together in her chest, as she listened to her private, precious hours in the garden, reduced to a political liability discussed in cold, careful terms. She thought of home, suddenly, with an intensity that surprised her, the quiet safety of her small cottage, the simple predictability of a life where no one watched her every move for signs of scandal. "What would you have me do, Colton?" the king asked, his gaze flicking briefly toward Elira before returning to his advisor. "Abandon the only honest conversation I've had since this selection began, because rumor has twisted it into something ugly? I would have you consider," Briggs said carefully, "whether the cost of that honesty is worth what it threatens to unravel. I am not asking you to abandon Miss Marsh entirely. I am asking you to think carefully about how you proceed from here, for both your sakes." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, and Elira, unable to bear it any longer, finally spoke. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the simplest solution is for me to withdraw from the selection. If I'm gone, the rumors will have nothing left to feed on, and Your Majesty can proceed without this distraction." "No." The king's response came immediate and firm, surprising them both with its sharpness. He seemed to catch himself a moment later, softening his tone, though not his conviction. "I will not have you punished for a rumor built on lies, Elira. If anyone should withdraw from anything, it will not be you." Briggs studied the two of them for a long moment, something shifting in his careful, calculating expression, as though he were reassessing a situation he had assumed, until this very moment, was far simpler than it actually was. "Then I would suggest," he said finally, "that we address this directly, rather than allowing rumor to dictate the narrative. A public trial, difficult enough to demonstrate Miss Marsh's worth beyond any accusation of favoritism, might silence the whispers more effectively than any denial we could offer." The king considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "Then we will find such a trial," he said. "One difficult enough that no one could accuse her of receiving unearned advantage." His eyes found Elira's across the room, steady and reassuring, despite the tension still coiled through his shoulders. "I am sorry," he added quietly, "that my attention has brought this difficulty upon you. That was never my intention." "I know," Elira said softly, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. She left the audience chamber that night with a new, uneasy resolve settling over her, understanding that whatever fragile peace she had found in the palace gardens would now have to survive a far more public test, one that would either silence Leanne Voss's cruel rumors for good, or destroy whatever chance remained for the quiet, honest connection she had never expected to find within these walls. The announcement came 2 days later, delivered by herald across the entire palace grounds, so that no contestant, no servant, no visiting noble could claim ignorance of what was to follow. The remaining contestants, now numbering fewer than 200, would face what the herald called the trial of truth, a public examination before the full council of noble packs, in which each woman's history, character, and conduct would be laid bare for open questioning. Elira understood immediately what this meant for her. While other contestants might face polite, ceremonial questions about their pack lineage or their hopes for the kingdom, She would face something far sharper, an open invitation for anyone, including Leanne Voss, to raise the very accusations already whispered through every corridor of the palace. She spent the 2 days before the trial in a state of controlled dread, rehearsing possible questions in her mind, trying to prepare answers that would neither confirm nor dismiss what had passed between herself and the king, without knowing precisely what those answers should be. Maren stayed close throughout, offering what comfort she could, though even her steady friend could not entirely mask her own worry about what the public trial might reveal. "Whatever happens," Maren told her the night before, as they sat together in their shared room while their 2 other roommates slept, "remember that you've done nothing wrong. You met a lonely man in a garden and talked to him honestly. That isn't a scandal, no matter how Voss tries to twist it. Try telling that to a council full of noble lords who've never had to prove their honesty against a room full of accusers," Alira said, staring at her hands. "You survived every trial so far, without any of the training the other women had," Maren reminded her. "You balanced glasses on a beam you'd never practiced walking. You recited titles you'd never studied. You demonstrated medicine you taught yourself from a dying woman's memory. If you can survive all of that, you can survive tomorrow too." Alira held on to those words as she dressed the next morning in the plainest, simplest gown she owned, refusing to borrow anything more elaborate from the other contestants, unwilling to present herself as anything other than exactly who she was. If she was going to face this trial, she would face it honestly, without pretense, the same way she had approached every other moment since arriving at Thorn Palace. The Great Hall, when she entered it that morning, had been transformed for the occasion. The rows of contestants had thinned considerably since her first day, but a new addition dominated the space, a long table set before the dais, where the king's throne remained empty for now, occupied instead by a dozen noble lords and ladies representing the kingdom's most powerful packs. Among them, Alira recognized several names Briggs had mentioned in passing over the weeks, families whose alliance or disapproval could shift the very foundations of the crown's stability. Leanne Voss sat near the front of the assembled contestants, her posture perfectly composed, her expression carrying only the faintest hint of anticipation that made Alira's stomach twist with dread. She had no doubt Leanne had prepared carefully for this moment, gathering whatever fragments of rumor and half-truth she could weave into a damning narrative. The trial proceeded through the morning with agonizing slowness. Contestant after contestant called forward to answer questions about their lineage, their character, their vision for the kingdom's future. Most exchanges passed without incident, polite formalities exchanged between confident young women and mildly curious nobles. But the tension in the hall grew steadily, with each passing hour, everyone aware that the trial's true drama waited somewhere further down the list. When Alira's name was finally called, she rose from her seat with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the entire hall could hear it, and walked the long distance to stand before the assembled council, acutely aware of the king's presence as he entered and took his throne just before her turn began, his expression carefully composed into royal neutrality, though she caught, for the briefest moment, something steadying in the way his eyes met hers before the questioning began. The first questions came easily enough, an older lord asking about her pack's history, a lady inquiring politely about her healing skills, demonstrated in an earlier trial. Alira answered each with careful honesty, her voice steadier than she expected, drawing on the quiet confidence Maren's encouragement had helped restore. Then Leanne Voss rose from her seat, requesting, with perfect courtesy, permission to address the council directly regarding a matter of some concern. The hall fell silent as the council granted her request, and Alira felt every muscle in her body tense in preparation for whatever accusation was about to follow. "I do not raise this lightly," Leanne began, her voice carrying easily through the hushed hall, pitched perfectly between concern and reluctant duty. "But I have witnessed, on more than one occasion, Miss Marsh meeting privately and unchaperoned with His Majesty in the palace gardens, well after the hour, when contestants are expected to remain in their quarters. I raise this not to condemn her character, but because I believe the council deserves to know how certain contestants may have secured favor through means that have nothing to do with the trials meant to determine our worth." A murmur rippled through the hall, noble lords exchanging glances, other contestants leaning forward with undisguised interest. Alira felt her face flush, humiliation and fury warring in equal measure. But she forced herself to remain still, to breathe, to remember Marin's words from the night before. She had done nothing wrong. Whatever happened next, she would not let shame twist her into someone she was not. One of the council lords, an older man with a stern expression, turned his attention directly to her. "Is this accusation true, Miss Marsh? Have you met privately with His Majesty outside the sanctioned proceedings of this selection?" "Yes," Elira said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "I have met with His Majesty in the gardens, on several evenings, when neither of us could sleep. We talked about our homes, our families, the burdens we each carry in different ways. Nothing more than honest conversation passed between us, and I offer no apology for it, because I have done nothing to be ashamed of." "Convenient words," Leanne interjected smoothly, from a woman with every reason to protect whatever advantage those meetings have earned her. "Then ask me anything," Elira said, turning to face Leanne directly for the first time, something fierce rising in her chest that surprised even herself. "Ask me what advantage I've gained from those conversations. I have no pack alliance to offer the crown. No wealth, no political standing, nothing the council could possibly value in a match. If I sought favor through those meetings, Lady Voss, I have gained remarkably little to show for it, beyond rumors that now threaten to destroy the only honest friendship I've found within these walls." The hall fell silent at the raw honesty in her voice, and for a moment, even Leanne seemed uncertain how to proceed, her carefully prepared accusation meeting something she had not anticipated: unashamed truth, rather than flustered denial. It was the king who finally broke the silence, rising from his throne with quiet authority that immediately commanded the hall's full attention. "I will address this directly," he said, "since it concerns my own conduct as much as Miss Marsh's. I have indeed spoken with her privately in the gardens, on several occasions, and I make no apology for it either. In 2 years upon this throne, surrounded by advisors and nobles who want something from me at every turn, I have found in those conversations something I have rarely encountered elsewhere in this palace: honesty without agenda. If the council wishes to condemn that, they are welcome to condemn me alongside her, since I sought those conversations as eagerly as she allowed them." The declaration, delivered with unmistakable conviction before the full assembled council, sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the hall, though this time, Elira noted with cautious hope, the tone had shifted, curiosity replacing scandal, admiration mixing uncertainly with surprise. Leanne's composure finally cracked, just slightly, her carefully arranged plan unraveling before the entire court. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice tighter now, "surely the council must consider whether such conduct reflects the discipline expected of the crown, regardless of intention." "The council may consider whatever it wishes," the king said, his gaze steady on Leanne before shifting back to Elira, something warm and unguarded passing briefly across his expression despite the formal setting. "But I will not apologize for seeking honesty in a place built almost entirely on performance. If that troubles anyone here, I suggest they examine what that says about the standards we have allowed to govern this court, rather than what it says about the woman brave enough to offer truth in a hall full of practiced smiles." Elira stood in stunned silence as the council murmured among themselves, several of the older lords exchanging thoughtful glances rather than the disapproving frowns she had feared. The trial, meant to expose and humiliate her, had instead revealed something else entirely: a king willing to defend her openly, before the very court whose approval he needed most, and a truth about her own character that no amount of rumor could easily undo. She caught Marin's eye across the hall, her friend's face bright with relief and quiet triumph, and for the first time since the rumors began, Elira allowed herself to breathe fully, understanding that whatever came next, she had survived this trial with her honesty, and perhaps something even more precious, still intact. The days following the trial of truth brought a shift in the palace atmosphere that Elira could feel in every corridor she walked. The whispered rumors did not vanish entirely, but their character changed, curiosity replacing scorn, quiet respect creeping into glances that had once carried only suspicion. Servants who had watched her warily now offered small kindnesses, an extra portion at the evening meal, a warmer blanket left on her bed without explanation. Even contestants who had kept their distance began approaching her with cautious friendliness, drawn by the story that had spread through the palace of a quiet Omega, who had stood before the full council, and spoken truth without flinching. Colton Briggs sought her out privately 2 days after the trial, finding her in the palace library, where she had taken to spending her rare free hours among the healing texts she had never before had access to. He approached with none of the guarded formality she had grown accustomed to from him, settling instead into the chair across from her, with an expression she could not quite place. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble. "I believed, when this began, that your presence in the selection posed a risk to the crown's stability, an unearned distraction from the alliances we needed to secure. I see now that I misjudged the situation entirely. You were only trying to protect the kingdom," Elira said carefully. "I understand that." "Perhaps," Briggs said, "but I have served this crown for over 20 years, Miss Marsh, through the old king's reign, and now his son's, and I have watched a great many contestants come through selections and courtships meant to secure the throne's future. I have rarely seen a king defend anyone the way he defended you before that council, not out of political necessity, but because he could not bear to see you wrongly accused. That is not something easily manufactured for show." He studied her carefully. "I find myself, against my own better political instincts, hoping this ends well for you both." Elira did not know how to respond to such an admission from a man who had, weeks earlier, argued so forcefully that her presence threatened the very stability of the crown. She settled for simple gratitude, and Briggs left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving her alone with her herbal texts, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest. But not everyone within the palace walls had softened toward her in the aftermath of the trial. Leanne Voss's public humiliation before the council had done nothing to dampen her ambition, only sharpened it into something colder and more determined. Elira felt the weight of her rival's continued scrutiny in every hallway, every shared meal, every trial that followed, Leanne's eyes tracking her with the patient, calculating focus of a predator who had merely changed strategy, rather than abandoned the hunt entirely. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived not through public accusation, but through something far more personal and far more painful. It began with a letter, delivered to Elira's room by an unfamiliar palace messenger, on a gray, overcast afternoon nearly 3 weeks after the trial of truth. The seal was her own family's mark, simple and unadorned, and her hands trembled as she broke it open, fear coiling immediately in her stomach at the unexpected arrival of news from home. The letter was from Garrick, her brother, and its contents struck her with the force of a physical blow. Their family's debts to the northern Pax had grown beyond what their small holding could manage, and Garrick, desperate and increasingly reckless in his drinking, had made a decision that Elira read with mounting horror. He had approached a representative of the Voss Pact directly, offering information about Elira's private conduct within the palace, in exchange for forgiveness of a portion of their debt, information he claimed to have gathered from a servant with connections inside Thorn Palace, though the letter made clear he had embellished considerably beyond whatever fragments of truth he actually possessed. Elira sat frozen on her narrow bed, the letter trembling in her hands, understanding with sick clarity that her own brother had sold whatever fragments of her reputation remained, not out of malice, but out of the same desperate weakness that had governed his choices her entire life. And worse, she understood immediately who had orchestrated the exchange, who had reached out to a struggling, indebted family in a remote southern valley with an offer designed specifically to extract damaging information. Leanne Voss had not given up at all. She had simply found a new, crueler avenue to pursue her goal. Elira did not know how to process the tangled mixture of grief and anger that settled over her. Grief for a brother whose weakness had once again cost her something precious, anger at Leanne's ruthless persistence, and beneath it all, a sharp, aching fear of what fabricated story might now be circulating among the noble Pax, twisted far beyond whatever honest truth had survived the council's earlier trial. She found Marin in their shared room that evening and, unable to keep the weight of the letter to herself any longer, explained everything in a low, unsteady voice. Marin listened with growing anger of her own, her hands curling into fists by the time Elira finished. "That family owes you nothing but harm," Marin said fiercely. "A brother willing to sell his own sister's reputation for a fraction of his debts forgiven does not deserve to call himself family at all." "He's still my brother," Elira said quietly, though the words carried little conviction. "I know what he did was wrong, but I understand why he did it too. We've been drowning in debt for years, and he's never known how to manage anything without making it worse. Understanding him doesn't mean you have to excuse what this could cost you, Maren said. You need to tell the king, before Voss twists whatever half-truths she's gathered into something far uglier than what actually happened. Alira knew Maren was right, but the thought of seeking out the king with this new, painful complication settled heavily in her chest. She had already asked so much of him, had already watched him defend her before the full council, at considerable political risk to his own standing. To bring him yet another crisis, born this time from her own family's weakness, felt like asking for more than she had any right to expect. But the choice was taken from her the following morning, when a summons arrived requesting her presence in the private audience chamber once more, and she understood, with a sinking heart, that whatever Liane had done with the information from Garrick's letter had already begun to spread. The king was waiting when she arrived, his expression carrying a tightness she had not seen since the trial of truth, though this time, she noted with cautious relief, it seemed directed not at her, but at the situation itself. Colton Briggs stood nearby, a fresh sheet of parchment in his hands, his own expression grim. A report has reached the council, the king said without preamble, claiming that your family sold information about your conduct in exchange for debt forgiveness from the Voss pack, and that the information exchanged includes claims far more damaging than anything raised in your earlier trial. I want to hear the truth from you directly, before I respond to any of it. Alira, though her heart pounded with fear at the confirmation that the rumor had already reached the palace's highest circles, found a strange, steadying calm settling over her as she met his gaze directly. She had faced this kind of moment before, in the great hall before the full council, and she had survived it with nothing but honesty as her shield. My brother is deeply in debt, she said, and desperate enough to sell fragments of gossip about me to the Voss pack, in exchange for relief from that debt. Whatever claims he made beyond the truth of our garden conversations were exaggerations, meant to make the information seem more valuable than it actually was. I have done nothing beyond what I already confessed before the council weeks ago. She paused, then added, quieter but no less firm, I am not responsible for my brother's choices, my lord. I never asked him to enter me into this selection in the first place. I never asked for any of what has followed. The king studied her for a long moment, and whatever tension had gathered in his shoulders seemed, slowly, to ease. I have believed you from the very first conversation in that garden, Alira, and nothing Lady Voss manufactures through desperate, indebted men will change that. He turned to Briggs. Find out exactly what was promised to her family, and see that whatever debt forgiveness was offered in exchange for this fabrication is revoked entirely. I will not have the Voss pack purchasing lies at the expense of an innocent woman's reputation. Briggs nodded and departed to see the matter handled, leaving Alira alone once more with the king in the quiet audience chamber. She felt the sudden weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, weeks of trials and rumors, and now this fresh betrayal from her own family, finally catching up to her all at once. I'm sorry, she said quietly, unable to meet his eyes any longer. I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to your door. You haven't brought trouble, he said gently, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. Lady Voss has brought trouble, through her own ambition and cruelty. You have brought nothing to my door but honesty, Alira, and I find I value that more than I have ever valued anything else in this palace. He reached out, hesitant but sure, and brushed a strand of hair gently away from her face, the touch light but carrying a weight that settled deep in her chest. Whatever comes next, in this selection or beyond it, I do not intend to let anyone take that honesty from either of us. Alira did not trust herself to speak, her throat tight with an emotion she had not allowed herself to name until this very moment. She simply nodded, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Thorn Palace, to lean slightly into the warmth of his presence, trusting that whatever came next, she would not have to face it entirely alone. News of the revoked debt forgiveness reached the Voss pack within days, and with it, an unmistakable message from the crown that further attempts to manufacture scandal would not be tolerated. Liane's public standing within the palace suffered visibly in the aftermath, several of the noble packs who had once courted her family's favor, now regarding her with newfound caution, wary of aligning themselves too closely with someone whose ambition had led her to purchase lies from a desperate, indebted family. Illyra did not take pleasure in her rival's fall from favor, understanding too well the particular ache of watching one's own carefully built position crumble, but she could not deny the relief that came with knowing Leanne's most dangerous weapon had finally been disarmed. The selection continued, the remaining trials growing steadily more demanding, as the number of contestants narrowed further still, down to 50, then 30, then finally a small circle of just 12 women, from whom the council expected the king to choose his final mate. Illyra remained among them, though she still found herself surprised, each time a new dismissal list was posted, that her name had not appeared among those sent home. She spoke of this disbelief one evening in the garden. The two of them settled into their now familiar spot by the fountain, the autumn air carrying a crispness that hinted at the winter still to come. "I still don't understand how I've survived this long," she admitted, watching the moonlight ripple across the fountain's surface. "I have no formal training, no pack alliance worth mentioning. Every other woman remaining in this circle brings something valuable to the crown that I simply don't possess." "You bring something none of them can offer," he said, turning to face her fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it in the formal light of the great hall. "You bring yourself, without pretense, without calculation. I have spent 2 years surrounded by people who see the crown before they see the man wearing it, Illyra. You have never once looked at me that way. From the very first day, in a hall full of thousands of women who wanted to be queen, you were the only one who simply wanted to survive the day without drawing attention. That kind of honesty is rarer in this palace than any noble bloodline, and I have come to value it more than anything the other contestants could offer." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold winter, and she found herself, for the first time since the selection began, allowing herself to imagine a future she had never dared consider before. Not the crown itself, which still felt like a burden too heavy and unfamiliar to fully grasp, but simply more evenings like this one, more honest conversation, more of the quiet, unguarded warmth that had grown steadily between them over the weeks. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly, surprising herself with the confession. "Not of the trials anymore, or even of Lady Voss. I'm afraid of wanting something I was never supposed to want. My whole life, I've trained myself not to hope for more than survival. If I let myself hope for this, and it's taken from me, I don't know how I'll bear the loss." He reached for her hand then, his fingers warm and steady around hers, and she did not pull away. "I cannot promise you certainty," he said honestly. "The council still weighs political alliances heavily in their council, and I know there are those who would prefer I choose someone whose pack strengthens the kingdom's borders, rather than someone I have simply come to care for. But I can promise you this, Illyra. Whatever choice I make in the end, it will be made honestly, not out of political calculation, but out of what I have actually found in these quiet hours with you. That is more than I can say for anything else in this palace." She did not answer with words, unable to find any that felt adequate to the moment, but she allowed herself, finally, to lean into him fully, resting her head against his shoulder, as the fountain trickled softly beside them, and for a long while, neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together beneath the autumn moon, two people who had found, against every expectation, something honest and unguarded, in a place built almost entirely on performance and calculation. The final weeks of the selection passed in a blur of increasingly difficult trials, each one designed to test not surface charm, but genuine character, genuine wisdom, genuine capacity to bear the weight of a kingdom's future. Illyra found herself drawing, again and again, on the quiet strength she had spent her whole life undervaluing, her steady hands, her practical wisdom, her instinct to protect those around her before considering her own advantage. Where other contestants faltered under the mounting pressure, snapping at rivals, or crumbling under the council's sharp questioning, Illyra met each challenge with the same calm steadiness that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life before ever setting foot in Thorn Palace. Leanne Voss, though weakened in standing, did not withdraw from the competition, clinging instead to whatever remaining advantage her pack's power and her own considerable skill could still offer. She performed brilliantly in every remaining trial, her political knowledge and formal training evident in every calculated answer, every graceful gesture. Illyra could not deny her rival's genuine capability, understanding that whatever personal animosity existed between them, Leanne possessed real strengths that would serve any kingdom well, strengths born of years of deliberate preparation, rather than the accidental resilience Illyra had cultivated through hardship alone. By the time the council announced the final trial, narrowing the remaining contestants down to just 3 women who would await the king's ultimate decision, both Illyra and Leanne remained among them, along with a quiet, thoughtful contestant named Odessa Vane, whose steady competence had earned her a place in the final circle, through sheer, consistent excellence, across every trial, without ever drawing the kind of dramatic attention that had followed both Illyra and Leanne throughout the selection. The night before the final ceremony, Illyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind cycling endlessly through every possible outcome, every reason the council might push the king toward Leanne's powerful alliance, rather than her own uncertain, unremarkable standing. She slipped once more into the palace gardens, seeking the quiet comfort of the fountain and the cool night air, and found, as she often did now, the king already waiting there, as though some part of him had known she would come. "Tomorrow decides everything," she said quietly, settling beside him on the familiar stone bench. "Tomorrow decides nothing that hasn't already been decided," he said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a certainty that steadied something anxious in her chest. "I made my choice weeks ago, Illyra, in this very garden, the first night you found me here unable to sleep. Everything since then has only confirmed what I already knew." She searched his face in the moonlight, hardly daring to hope that his words meant what she thought they meant. "Even knowing what the council might prefer? Even knowing Lady Voss brings alliances and strengths I could never offer this kingdom?" "The kingdom needs more than alliances and strengths, though those matter too," he said. "It needs a queen, whose judgment I can trust without question, whose honesty I never have to doubt, whose presence beside me makes even the heaviest burdens of this crown feel lighter rather than heavier still. I have found that only in you, and no political alliance, however valuable, could ever replace what that honesty means to me." He reached for her hand again, holding it gently, but with unmistakable conviction. "Tomorrow, the ceremony will simply make public what has already been true in my heart for weeks. I choose you, Illyra Marsh, not because the council demands a queen, but because I want you beside me, for exactly the reasons that have nothing to do with crowns or thrones at all." Illyra felt tears gather in her eyes, unbidden and entirely unexpected, relief and joy and lingering disbelief tangling together into something too large for words. She had come to this palace expecting nothing but survival, hoping only to escape unnoticed and return to the quiet, familiar burdens of her old life. She had never imagined, not for a single moment, that she would leave this selection, having found something so much larger than survival, something she had never before allowed herself to want. "I choose you too," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I have, since that very first night in this garden, though I was too afraid to admit it even to myself." He drew her close then, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together beneath the same autumn moon that had witnessed the slow, careful growth of something neither of them had expected to find within these palace walls, something built not on performance or political calculation, but on the simple, rare foundation of 2 people who had finally, after so much difficulty, allowed themselves to be honestly and completely seen. The morning of the final ceremony arrived gray and cold. The kind of sharp autumn air that promised winter was close behind, and Illyra woke long before dawn, her heart caught somewhere between terror and a fragile, disbelieving joy she barely dared to trust. Maren helped her dress in silence, both of them aware that whatever happened within the next few hours would change the course of Illyra's life entirely, one way or another, though only Illyra carried the quiet certainty of what the king had promised her the night before. The great hall, when she finally entered it, had been transformed once more, this time into something grander than she had ever seen it. Banners of the kingdom's colors draped from every pillar, the full assembly of noble packs gathered in their finest formal dress, and at the center of it all, 3 women standing before the dais, awaiting the council's final proceedings and the king's ultimate decision. Odessa Vane stood calm and composed, her quiet dignity unwavering even in this moment of enormous consequence. Leanne Voss stood with her chin lifted, copper hair gleaming beneath the chandeliers, her confidence still intact despite the weeks of diminished standing, clearly still believing, or at least hoping, that her pack's power and her own considerable skill might yet secure her the throne. and Alira stood between them, in a simple gown of deep blue, rather than the elaborate silks the other two wore, her only ornament a small pendant that had belonged to her mother, the one piece of jewelry she owned that carried any real meaning at all. Colton Briggs stepped forward first, addressing the assembled hall with the formal gravity the occasion demanded, reviewing the long weeks of trials, the character and capability each of the three finalists had demonstrated across every test the selection had presented. He spoke of Odessa's steady excellence, of Leanne's considerable political skill and powerful alliance, and finally, with a warmth Alira had not expected from the man who had once argued so forcefully against her presence in the competition, of the quiet resilience and unwavering honesty that had carried an unremarkable Omega from a small southern pack, through trial after trial, never through advantage or artifice, but through simple, steady character, that had, in the end, proven more valuable than any of them had initially understood. Then the king rose from his throne, and the entire hall fell silent, every eye fixed on him, as he descended the dais steps to stand before the three finalists, his gaze moving briefly over Odessa, then Leanne, before settling, and remaining, on Alira. "I was told, when this selection began," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall, "that I needed to choose a mate who would strengthen this kingdom's alliances, who would bring power and standing sufficient to secure the throne's future against any who might challenge it. I do not deny the wisdom in that counsel. A kingdom's stability matters, and I have taken that responsibility seriously throughout every week of this competition." He paused, his gaze steady on the assembled council, before returning once more to the three women before him. "But I have come to understand something else in these past months, something I do not believe any political alliance alone could ever provide. A kingdom's true stability rests not only in the power of its borders, but in the character of those who sit upon its throne, and in the honesty of the counsel a king receives from the person closest to his heart." He turned then, fully, to face Alira, and though she had known, since the night before, what he intended to say, hearing the words spoken aloud before the full assembled court still stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "From the very first day of this selection," he continued, "in a hall filled with thousands of women, each hoping to catch my attention, there was only one who wanted nothing from me at all. She did not seek my notice. She did not perform for my favor. She simply lived with honesty in a place built almost entirely on calculation, and in doing so, she taught me more about what I actually need in a queen than any trial or counsel ever could." His voice softened, though it lost none of its conviction. "Alira Marsh, you have never once asked me for anything beyond honesty, and it is precisely because you asked for nothing that you have given me more than I ever expected to find in this selection. I choose you, not because the council demands it, not because your pack offers power I require, but because I cannot imagine facing the weight of this crown with anyone else beside me." A stunned silence rippled through the hall, broken a moment later by a low murmur of surprise and, gradually, growing warmth. Several of the older noble lords nodding slowly, as though recognizing something true in the king's declaration that outweighed whatever political calculations they might have preferred. Leanne Voss stood frozen for a long moment, her carefully composed expression finally cracking into something raw and unguarded, disappointment and disbelief warring openly across her features, before she managed to steady herself once more, offering a stiff, formal bow toward the king, and retreating quietly from the dais without another word. Odessa Vane, gracious even in this moment of loss, offered Alira a small, genuine smile, before stepping back as well, leaving Alira standing alone before the king and the full assembled court. He reached for her hand, and this time, before the eyes of the entire kingdom, she did not hesitate to take it. "Alira Marsh," he said, loud enough now that every corner of the great hall could hear him clearly, "will you accept the crown, and stand beside me, not as a symbol of alliance, but as the honest heart I have come to need beside my own?" Tears gathered in her eyes, unbidden and entirely unashamed this time, as she looked out at the vast hall, at the thousands of memories that had led her to this single moment, the frightened girl who had arrived wanting only to disappear, the quiet trials survived through steadiness rather than performance, the garden conversations that had slowly, carefully built something neither of them had expected to find. She thought of her mother's pendant resting against her collarbone, of the small healer's cottage she had once believed was the only life she would ever know, of Marin's steady friendship, and even, strangely, of her brother's flawed but very human weakness that had, despite everything, played its own part in the long road that brought her here. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I will." The hall erupted into applause, the great chandeliers seeming to blaze brighter as the assembled nobles rose to their feet, and somewhere near the back of the crowd, Maren wept openly with joy, clapping harder than anyone else in the entire hall. The king drew Alira close, and for a long moment, the noise and spectacle of the crowded court faded into something distant and unimportant, leaving only the two of them, standing together at last, exactly where they had both, quietly and separately, hoped to be. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom slowly came to understand what the king had recognized from the very first day of the selection, that Alira's quiet strength, so easily overlooked in a hall full of thousands competing for attention, had never been a weakness at all, but the very quality that made her worthy of the crown. She brought her healing knowledge to the palace physicians, establishing new practices that saved lives among the common packs who had never before had access to such care. She brought her steady, practical wisdom to the king's council, offering counsel rooted not in political theory, but in genuine understanding of what ordinary families across the kingdom actually needed to thrive. And she brought, most of all, the same honest, unguarded heart that had first caught the king's attention across a crowded hall, a heart that never once changed, even after the crown had been placed upon her head. Word spread throughout the kingdom, and beyond it, of the Alpha King who had looked past thousands of eager, hopeful faces to choose the one woman who had wanted nothing at all. And in the years that followed, that story became the kind mothers told their daughters on quiet evenings, not a tale of beauty or ambition rewarded, but a gentle reminder that the quietest hearts often carry the deepest strength, and that sometimes, the person who never sought to be noticed is exactly the one worth noticing most of all.